So this is Naveen Tooley and Olivia Seat from Major Lindsey in Africa. Delighted to be joined today by Lisa Mather, who is the Chief International Counsel with PayPal. Lisa, very nice to see you again, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Naveen. It's a pleasure to be with you today, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Great. Now, Lisa, you and I have known each other for a while, I think from certainly when we first met in Hong Kong, and you've lived in and worked in, obviously Sydney, where you're from, and then Singapore, Hong Kong, New York. It'd be great to, share a bit more about your journey and how it started and what took you to all these different countries.
Yeah, really happy to do that, Olivia. Thank you. Look, I am sort of originally an Australian lawyer, qualified and first admitted here in New South Wales, Australia. I think I was very lucky from early in my career to have the opportunity to combine my passion for different cultures and experiencing different cultures and being immersed in different cultures with my professional journey over time. And that kind of started for me, I would say. I took a gap year before there was even a name for gap years, and spent time as a student for 12 months living in Denmark before I went to university. And it was kind of life-changing for me, I think. It was one of those kind of just really, looking back now, quite pivotal sort of experiences in life where I just grew so much through doing that and got such an incredible buzz out of doing it that I wanted that again in my life. And kind of funnily enough, when I started to study law, it was during that period I decided that I would study law. I was a bit worried actually that law is very jurisdictionally based and that I wouldn't have the ability to work in different jurisdictions, being sort of, technically sort of expert in the law of one jurisdiction. But I sort of learnt through sort of, those years, and then going into private practice in one of the large firms, which I did when I first came out of law school, that there were different ways to sort of bring that sort of desire for those experiences together with working as a lawyer. And so I sort of worked in M&A. And as we all know, there are many different places that you can go and work working in M&A. And so I went to Hong Kong very early in my career, actually, and had that experience, and sort of registered as a foreign lawyer there. Attempted to learn Cantonese in my extremely limited spare time, and just got a tremendous amount professionally out of the 3.5 years that I spent early in my career in Hong Kong. And I think that just kind of, again, like set me up for more of that down the track. I actually then went back to Australia and spent a number of years working back in Australia. And then when I moved in-house to my previous organisation, Colgate-Palmolive, they asked me if I'd be interested in going offshore for a role with them. And first of all, they sent me to the Czech Republic, actually. So we relocated to Prague for a couple of years, which again, you kind of go like, I don't speak Czech. I didn't really know very much at the time about EU law, really. I was admitted in the UK, which is, was part of the EU back in those days. But I think, I learned that organisations are looking for particular sort of attributes and skill sets. And I think we all now know through COVID, adaptability and agility and flexibility are so important, and sort of having members of teams who you have confidence that you can do a bit of a plug and play with them in different parts of the world. So I sort of developed, I guess, skill sets and cultivated sort of trust and relationships based on that. And so off the back of that, I was sent to New York for a specialist role in the organisation, and then back to Hong Kong for an APAC GC role before I joined PayPal in Singapore on the international side. So incredibly fortunate to have had the experiences. But
it's great, Lisa, that when you were back in Denmark, you were thinking, how am I going to marry being a lawyer and an international career? And then you ended up in Hong Kong, Czech Republic, and New York with your employer.
Yeah, look, and I mean, I think to me that just underscores, again, like the luxury of some hindsight here, and you must think I'm a dinosaur given what I've just relayed in terms of what I've done by now. But I think, there is a lot of scope these days for sort of having, bringing your whole self to work. And I think organisations are looking for that, and we should feel, appropriately so, but empowered nonetheless to have those discussions with our employers around those career ambitions and what you bring to the table as a person from, very much a 360 perspective. And I think global talent is not in an abundant supply. I mean, you guys know more about that than I do, I guess, but it's one thing to sort of talk about in theory, but it's another to sort of live through effectively. And things like cultural awareness, maybe sometimes linguistic skills. I mean, there's many different dimensions that have to sort of come into play for that to work.
Absolutely. And what is the best career advice you've received along the way?
Yeah, look, probably one piece of advice which I also like to share. In fact, I was meeting a junior lawyer today and we were talking about exactly this topic, and that is particularly for in-house moves. I think it's very important to have that long-term view around the type of work and the opportunities that certain organisations might present. And does that measure up well with your own career aspirations and what you're looking for in terms of your in-house experience? So obviously doing your DD on the organisation, due diligence on the organisation, but also, there's so many different industry sectors out there and so many different sort of points of maturity of organisations. You're going to have a very different work experience and career risk and career opportunity choosing to go and work for a startup than you are for, like a 200-year-old financial institution. So really thinking all of that through and really knowing what you're looking for, and then seeking that out with some focus and intent is something that I talk about a lot with people. And it was some advice that was given to me, which I really valued and have reaped the benefits of, I would say.
Sure. And how did you come to that? I think that, a lot of people have the challenge now of having so many options, right? There are, I know previously, the goal is to go into a big multinational that's global, that, there could be different ways that you could develop your career. And, I think job security and, was always something that was, very important, which I think job security is there, but it's not certainly, the primary reason why people join. So I think these days, I don't know, maybe it's not just these days, there are a lot of options. What advice would you give around, trying to figure out what you want to do? Is it a startup? Is it this, is it a big conglomerate? Is it something more local? Yep. Is it something giving back as opposed to corporate? What, if there's any advice that you can give?
Yeah. So look, I think there's a few things that are top of mind for me. Firstly, I think purpose. Because what are you looking for? What's your purpose? What type of legal work do you want to do if we're talking about legal roles? Because I think the other thing with in-house work is in certain situations you end up with a certain level of repetition in terms of the type of legal work that you might be asked to do. And that suits some people very, very well. And that's what they are looking for, that stability, that certainty. But for others, that may not sort of meet with their career runway aspirations, or, there's diversity of legal work that's part of what inspires and energizes them in their day-to-day. And then I think there's the people component. Are you comfortable sort of being like one lawyer in a given market, or do you prefer to work in a larger legal team where you get to bounce ideas off other colleagues more and learn from others more? So there are a couple of variables that I think is really worth thinking about.
Great. Thanks, Lisa. And you've obviously, done a lot in your career. What accomplishment are you most proud of?
Look, I have to say that it's hard to just come up with one, particularly when you've been working for a long time, but I genuinely really do enjoy seeing other lawyers flourish and progress and get a lot of, call it job satisfaction, professional satisfaction themselves. And I think through having had the opportunity to work with large legal teams, I like to think that I've had the opportunity to sort of cultivate that for larger, you know, teams of lawyers in different parts of the world. And I think just as I personally get inspired and motivated by working with people from different cultural backgrounds, I like to think that that is something that, you know, I can bring to sort of working with lawyers in other parts of the world too, you know, like that cross-fertilization of how you think and work as a lawyer, because I do think that the practice of law is actually quite culturally and linguistically bound, as well as just, you know, technically what's sort of, you know, in court cases and statute books and things. So I like to think that I've contributed materially to that for certain lawyers, and that actually just really makes me incredibly happy.
Oh, that's great. And who or what has been the biggest influence on you professionally?
So look, I mean, a couple of general counsels that I've come across in my career, just watching how they communicate, how they navigate, you know, uncharted waters and support their boards and organizations through those things. You know, I really sort of have to sort of say that there's been a lot of role modeling there that I've really benefited from. And then I think when you work in-house, you see that at play across different functions too. So I can certainly think of some, you know, some amazing marketers or some amazing finance professionals who, just the way they've navigated contexts in multinationals has been quite influential in terms of how I think about going through those things. And then in turn, how I coach members of my team in certain situations, or try and give them insights to how a business partner might actually, like what their orientation is when they come at particular issues and so forth. So to bring more, hopefully, insight and empathy to, you know, how we're providing legal support to other teams in companies. But they've probably been some of the most influential, but I don't underrate either the amount of tacit influence that you have in different working contexts too, which you probably don't even realize impact how you think about things and maybe how you work in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And then for yourself, how have you developed yourself, you know, to, or what have you worked on to get to where you are today?
So I am naturally like a lifelong learner. I couldn't imagine not being a lifelong learner. And so I think that's a very helpful sort of natural orientation or sort of attribute to have as being a lawyer. And one of the, like, if I think about that in a more sort of structured way, one of the things I did when I first had children, actually, when they were sort of babies, and I sort of had two children quite close together in age, actually started studying an MBA part-time. I think you might know that, Olivia. And so that was part of my lifelong learning journey, which, you know, obviously ended up, I think, developing me in terms of how I think about things much more sort of holistically and in a synthesized way, rather than through sort of a more blinkered, pure legal perspective. But as I said, I mean, I think there's that kind of structured learning which can really add value to how you develop as an attorney. But look, I think sort of your own sort of, there's different names for these things, whether you call them action learning cycles or continuous improvement reviews and things like that. I really try and come at, you know, each of the postings I've had and projects that I work on, particularly the large ones, with that sort of mindset. And it's worked for me, I have to say, but it's a lifelong journey. So I still feel like I've got my L plates on in many, many ways.
And Lisa, excuse me, can you tell us a little bit more about your current role as Chief International Counsel for PayPal in terms of the remit of your responsibility, the geographic remit, and the team structure and size?
Yep. Yeah. So a little bit more about that. So PayPal is a global corporation. We have a significant international business, and so I was originally hired it was a new role when I came into it, because the company, you know, it's not that old, as everybody knows, but has experienced explosive growth, and so there was a recognition that we needed more seniority and sort of seasoned oversight of some of the complex legal issues that were occurring in markets outside the United States. And we have lawyers in different parts of the world, but sort of having some sort of more focused leadership around how we sort of bring that team together is sort of the vision for that role. And so in that role, I've had teams of lawyers actually in the US too. So some specialty areas have rolled up into my international counsel role in terms of competition law, privacy law, and regulatory expertise. But then also large legal teams in Europe, Latin America, Brazil and Mexico in particular, and then across APAC too, with Singapore being our hub for our international headquarters. As we were talking about before, I've actually sort of just relocated during the course of the COVID pandemic to Sydney, and I'm now sort of drilling down not just on legal work for PayPal in Australia, but also taking on a broader remit across what we call business affairs. So sort of legal spreading over into government relations and communications. And that's been interesting for me too. And I think that's something that increasingly lawyers have opportunities around in organisations to work, into different functions. And I sort of, my own experience has been that counsel from lawyers, using that term broadly, is only more frequently sought these days, not the other way around. And so it's interesting to be able to delve into those other areas. But, it's part of that lifelong learning journey as well, isn't it? Around, what can I do that helps me grow and, hopefully add more value in the organisation.
That's a lot of time zones that you have to deal with there from Sydney, I would imagine, as well.
I think that, I probably had a bit of a head start on some folks in terms of managing across time zones, because I've always had to do it in that international role. Actually, I've been doing it for best part of 4 years in particular across the entire globe. And then I think without travel, many more of us have had to build that muscle in the last 12 months. And there's no easy answer. One secret I will tell you though about Sydney is I've actually found it a little bit easier than a Singapore or a Hong Kong in terms of dealing with, organisations that are headquartered back in the US, and particularly in my own organisation, we have sort of an East Coast and a West Coast presence of significance. So, there's a 3-hour time difference right there that you have to navigate too, and that would often mean late night calls as well as early morning calls, and you do what you can to try and get things in sort of a more humane clustering of calendar commitments, but it's not always possible. But the beauty of Sydney is that when you go to sleep, the United States is still not kind of up and running for their business day. So it's actually meant some freer hours in the evening, or more discretion over, managing my calendar in the evenings, which has been tremendous from a wellness perspective, which is important. And then, you just have that very full morning where that's kind of like the US is what you focus on in the morning when you get up. And I've actually found that really effective and productive, and a little bit easier than being based in Singapore, funnily enough.
And how when the world went into a pandemic, how did your team sort of, and you adapt to that? How did they how did they cope basically? How did you keep the morale up and keep everything intact?
Yeah, look, I think that's been a real journey for us, as I'm sure it has been for everybody. And, our legal team is large and it is quite dispersed. So there's sort of some good in that and some challenge as well that's had to be managed through. So firstly, we already had a certain amount of muscle built around working virtually and working across time zones, and doing a lot of video conferences and Zoom or Teams meetings or WebEx meetings, because we wouldn't have been able to function without that. So that was something I feel that we had a bit of a head start on. And I'm a great believer. In fact, a colleague of mine just sort of said to me the other day, you were pre-COVID such a travel warrior. And I mean, it's part of my DNA, as I've just explained to you earlier in our chat today, but I do believe that that's very, very important, to get on a plane and go and spend some time with, you know, members of your team physically. And you really reap the benefits of that. And so I found, as we went into sort of COVID and everybody working from home and people not being able to travel, for existing team members, there was a lot of rapport, trust and ability to communicate effectively, which had been established, because inherently, just because of how I like to work, I'd sort of really invested time in building that up through having people come to Singapore for conferences, or, you know, in-house team conferences there in market, as well as going out and spending time with them in market, whether it was, you know, a Luxembourg or a London or Shanghai or wherever. And then there was, you know, a very concerted effort between me and my direct reports all around the world, of a lot of sort of contacts and, you know, like checking in with folks. So early on in the pandemic, you know, we had teams in China and Italy who went through very long lockdowns and very harsh lockdowns, and just making sure we were looking after them. And then, you know, they appreciated that, but then they sort of leaned in, and we did that more with, you know, with them sort of being the outreach kind of leaders for a while, once we sort of went into the course of the pandemic over time. And I think that's the interesting thing about the pandemic, because often a crisis is a very short, sharp, acute type of experience, whereas this is as intense as a crisis, but it's longitudinal. You know, like, this is something that is going to probably take a couple of years to navigate through. And I think we've gone through a journey of, we're probably over-indexed on contact, or we tried to make sure we did, because we're very concerned about what it's like to sit in a room on your own and not be able to go out, you know, month after month, and the impact that has on people. But then you end up sort of not having good sort of work-life delineations, because you're sort of sleeping in the office, so to speak, rather than working from home. And so being respectful of people's time became more of an issue, I think, as we moved through the course of the pandemic, and making sure that people were taking good breaks from work rather than just, you know, immersing themselves in it endlessly, which is not sustainable and it's not healthy. And I just wouldn't feel good to think that teams were doing that. One thing that the company did, which I thought was amazing, and, you know, we really benefited from as a global legal function, was setting up global wellness days. And I think different organizations have done, you know, different things in this space to try and help employees. But I mean, everybody will say they've found that tremendous. And it's a little bit different to taking vacation, where you're the only one who's offline or trying to be offline, when you have sort of a designated wellness day where collectively as a team you have permission to, you know, not review and get that contract signed or whatever it happens to be, because you're not going to get that pressure from another function because you're all having a wellness day. So that's worked very well across the organisation, and people just continually give feedback, my team members, as to how much they value it and how it's helped them in terms of making sure that there's some consistent and healthy unplugging. But that's just one small thing. I mean, I think, you know, it doesn't make up for just making sure that we're instituting healthy, sustainable practices in terms of our day-to-day when we're working from home for such an incredibly extended period.
I do like the idea of wellness days. We could do with a few of those at MLA, I think. But
yeah, well, you've got my permission. I recommend them.
I'll take it to our president. And so looking forward, Lisa, what do you see as the sort of top challenges, top 2 or 3 challenges, whether for you as the Chief International Counsel or for the legal function, you know, going into 2021?
Yes. Look, I mean, as I was sort of alluding to before, I think that the way we work is not going, like 2019 is not going to come back for us, I don't think. Even, you know, fingers crossed that vaccination is an exit strategy for us that's really going to work as, you know, the species on the planet. So I think one of the, frankly, opportunities as well as challenges is the workplace of the future, and what, you know, what that looks like, and how we make that work for organizations as well as for our people. And so it's been interesting sort of having had the opportunity through the course of the pandemic to be based in Singapore and then to be based in Sydney. So for local businesses in Sydney, you know, things are pretty much back to normal. And, you know, I was talking to somebody from one of the big 4 accounting firms this morning, who's a partner here in Sydney, and he was saying, you know, we're all back 4 days a week, like that's how we're working now. But my sense in this market is people are generally sort of at the 2 or 3 days a week in the office, 2 or 3 days a week from home. And that seems to be sort of where, you know, sort of the water level is landing around this. And I think that's really interesting. So I'm spending a lot of time thinking about that and that flexibility. And I'm excited about it, actually. I think, you know, one of the things early in career in terms of my own personal experience and in terms of what I saw some of my peers go through was that desire to have some flexibility because, you know, you had young children or an elderly parent or some other, you know, sort of dimension of your life that required some flexibility to best support you in your work. And not everybody got it. Whereas I think now a lot more people get it, and they realise through an unplanned global pilot that it's possible to sustain high levels of productivity and to do incredible work in a much more flexible way, which is very exciting.
Yeah. No, we've certainly seen that as well from you know, from when we speak to General Counsel, they've, you know, over the past year, they've sort of spoken about how busy and how robust the legal function has been and how effective it's been remotely. So when it comes to hiring new people, there's an element of flexibility now. You can be more flexible. You can look at people from a more diverse background, you know, people who maybe don't need to be restricted to that location, and it just opens up the talent pool and aids diversity, aids mental health.
But I think that's the other sort of challenge or key challenge that I've experienced in the pandemic that I would call out to Naveen. And this is around how you virtually onboard new team members. So in the last 12 months, I've, you know, hired senior talent, also junior talent, but I'm thinking senior talent in countries as diverse as China and the US and probably a few places in between. And how you support people who are going to have really significant responsibilities in an organisation who have to work with business partners across all sorts of different countries and functions within the global organisation is something that doesn't happen well by accident. I think you've got to be quite sort of thoughtful and over-index in terms of how you help somebody onboard in that situation. And that's probably something you've sort of spoken with people a lot about, I imagine, over the last 12 months too, because it takes a brave person, I think, in some ways, to onboard into a new organisation virtually.
Very brave, I agree. Sorry, I think, Olivia, I think I cut you off there. Sorry, I think you were going to...
Oh, no, it's fine. No, I was just going to say, Lisa, I know that you we were talking before about, you know, where somebody can be placed, and you were in Singapore and you ended up going to Sydney, I know, to see your family, and you've now relocated. I think from what I understand, a lot of it due to the pandemic. Can you share a little bit about that and how I think people might be interested to see how you had that discussion internally about relocating?
Yep, absolutely. So look, I mean, I think, you know, one of the things that I've had a lot of practice on in my career is moving, you know, into different countries and things. And every time an opportunity of that nature came up, particularly as a mum, and in a family context, you know, big discussions about is that particular location and that move going to work for all family members? Is that an adventure that we're all happy to undertake? And, you know, that there's a lot of sort of, I think, soul searching that has to go into that, or should go into that. And despite the fact that we've had so many moves, there was a lot of soul searching each time, and maybe for different reasons. You know, each opportunity was a particularly compelling one that we decided that we were up for. Once the pandemic hit and my daughter was in senior high school and was looking at going to college this year, it just didn't work for us anymore. And so for the first time ever, I found myself in a situation where being in a foreign country, in a foreign city, just didn't work for me anymore, and I had to do something about it because, you know, I was in a situation where I didn't see my son for 7 months last year, and my daughter and I couldn't leave Singapore, otherwise she wouldn't have been able to finish high school. So, and all of this kind of like going through our head as we're dealing with the uncertainty of the pandemic. And so as we sort of, I guess, approach the middle of 2020, just started to have conversations with my line manager and HR, I guess, but predominantly my line manager, just around, you know, if the pandemic was going to continue and travel continued to not be easy or readily available, that I'd need to look at making some changes to where I was. And so we originally actually agreed that I would go back to Australia for a number of months, and then we'd kind of see how things would unfold. So then we just had more iterative conversation around, well, what does that look like? What will I do? And so then came this sort of idea of actually taking a more local focus for now to enable, but taking some other functions as well to enable me to stay in country with my family. And so now my daughter's in college here and my son is in his final year of school. And I am incredibly fortunate and frankly grateful to work for an organisation where there were opportunities available for me in the place that I needed to be, and that they created those opportunities, but also to work in an organisation, and frankly, I guess to have the courage. And that's one thing, maybe it's a bit easier when you're a bit more advanced in your career than in your early career stages, to have those conversations very honestly and authentically. And, you know, if travel was possible, I'd be the first to be out there, you know, sort of enjoying the best of the different, you know, cultures and opportunities across national boundaries. But that's not the way the world works at the moment. And I think it's really important to just keep those lines of communication open and to not be afraid, on a considered basis, of course, but to not be afraid to have those conversations. And often I think you'll be surprised, particularly these days, as to how much empathy and support you'll sort of experience in your organisation when you have those discussions. Because I think particularly for folks working in a place like Singapore, there are many of us who, you know, possibly find ourselves in those types of situations, particularly in the course of a pandemic, which is taking a few years to sort of work its way through.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, the loyalty comes back tenfold, really, from an employee perspective, right? So
yeah, very, very much so. I agree. And look, I'll say that in terms of my team too, I've never regretted giving somebody some flexibility where they've articulated a need. I think that's right, where there is a genuine need and, you know, sort of commitment to the organisation, the relationship that builds and the loyalty, as you say, is phenomenal. You can't manufacture that.
Yeah. And I'm just conscious of time because we're hitting 45 minutes. There are a few questions, Lisa, that we like to sort of end these interviews on. So I'll hand over to Olivia.
Right. Well, so one of the questions which may not be so relevant for you, Lisa, is, you know, when the lockdown ends, you know, and everything opens up, what's the first thing you will do? Just because Sydney's not really in like a lockdown, so to speak, right? I mean, I'm so jealous.
Look, I think it is still relevant because I'm literally, like, I am lucky, as I said, you know, like I'm in a city where you just, like, it's a bit of a head spin when you first get back. Like my family picked me up from quarantine when I was let out of quarantine here in Sydney, and I'm like walking out with a big massive mask all over my face, and they're like looking at me going, what are you doing? What's wrong with you? And I'm looking at them not wearing masks going, what are you guys doing? What's wrong with you? It is hard to imagine before you get here. But I think for me, one of the first things I will do is get on a plane and go somewhere. As lucky as I am to be here, I do miss, you know, friends, colleagues in different parts of the world. So I really look forward to that time again. And I know so many of us do too. So that will be my thing. I'll get my passport out and
use that. Yeah, use that passport. And where would you go? You know, where would you travel to that was not work related? What's the first place that you were going to go?
Yeah. So look, we as a family love to ski. And so we really, really hope to be able to go skiing in the Northern Hemisphere somewhere in, winter at the end of this calendar year. My son in particular, who's in his last year of high school, he sees that as a massive sort of motivating factor to get himself through these exams that he's, got underway at the moment. So I think we'll go anywhere that there's snow that will take us at the end of the year if we can, and obviously doing so safely. So there's obviously some great options in, Japan or Europe or the United States. So I'm not going to limit myself to one destination at this point.
Do a ski tour around.
Yeah.
And what would someone be surprised to find out about you? What is something that you think that many of us don't know about you?
Yeah, look, that is that's one that actually gives me a bit of a laugh, because I will tell you that I spent a week of my life being mistaken for potentially being Princess Mary, who's the Australian who married the Crown Prince of Denmark. So, yeah, when he was dating her in Sydney, I was also in Sydney at that time, and it was a bit of a Cinderella story with the glass slipper, and the Danish press had gotten some information from the Danish palace around this woman that the Crown Prince was dating, and it was, things like, age group, legally qualified, spoke Danish, like a couple of criteria. It was like the glass slipper. So then there was this rush on in Sydney to find the woman that fit these magical criteria. And they actually found 5 women who fit the criteria, and I was one of them. And so I was literally stalked and papped relentlessly for a week of my life until they found Mary and decided that Mary was the one, and that it wasn't me. So it could have been a princess. Who knows?
Okay, never would have guessed that.
Really interesting. And if you weren't a general counsel, Lisa, this is the last question for you. What would you have been? Well, there's still time, I guess.
There's still time. There's still time. Yeah, look, I was one of those people, and I'm not ashamed to say, I actually had no idea what I wanted to do when I left school. And I know some people, like, they really know for an early age what they want to do, and I just wasn't one of those people. And so I actually originally enrolled in pharmacy, and then during that gap year I was talking about, I thought, actually, it's a bit narrow. I think I want to do something a bit broader in terms of study, at least. But when I was a small child, this is a terrifying thought, I actually wanted to be a hairdresser, like passionately. I remember that as a child, passionately wanting to be a hairdresser. I don't know why. And I'm actually not very good with my hands. Like I would have been a really bad hairdresser. I'm clumsy. I'm not very good artistically. It's a terrifying thought, but I guess that was an option at one point.
Well, to be honest, it's probably a occupation that may not be easily taken over by AI.
No,
so,
that's right.
Yeah,
good point.
It could be, yeah.
Yeah, and it's something I think that we've also developed a much stronger appreciation of in lockdown, right? Like, I can tell you that my hair looked very differently before I went into lockdown last year than it looks now. It's a lot shorter and not so crazy, but yeah, I don't know. I would have been happy doing many things, I think, but there are a few things that spring to mind.
Lisa, that it's just been really good to spend this time with you and to get these little nuggets and insights from you. So wanted to thank you again for your time, and really appreciate it.
It was my pleasure. I really enjoyed speaking with you. So thank you for the opportunity. I really, really had fun.
Thanks, Lisa.
Thank you.